Hi everyone. I thought I'll make a quick video sharing my views on what's been going on with the tariffs announced by the US and the retaliation from Canada and Mexico and all of that. So, sharing my thoughts, the first question I would like to address is why is Trump kind of going about this way, and for that I like to put a little bit of context. So going essentially to summarize what's going on is the end of globalization as we know it. So globalization, you can think of it as kind of the international trade system that kind of started to be developed after World War II out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and then kind of intensified, in the beginning of the 1980s, after basically a lot of companies in the United States and other parts of the world decided to outsource their manufacturing production to other areas where labor costs were cheaper, like China and other parts of Asia. And so essentially that meant that things like the steel industry, the car manufacturing industry, and all of these manufacturing jobs were moved, quote unquote, from the United States to China. And this led to what became known as international supply chains, which is to say production of a good takes place all over the planet, and goods are shipped internationally. So you can think of globalization as a place where production takes place all over the world, and there is a lot of trade going on. In order to have trade, there's also a military element of this. The safety of the trade through, which mostly takes place by boat through international waters, is patrolled by the US Navy, which has the biggest navy in the world. So the US is at the center of that. And the flip side of that was in 2016, a man by the name of Donald Trump came and said, hey, look at all these people who in the 1980s, they used to live the American dream. They used to have a work at a manufacturing plant. One person, typically a husband, had a job. They had a home with a white picket fence. They buy home appliances, they buy all these things. And so it's the American dream. And then this outsourcing had the consequence that all these people living in the Rust Belt of the United States, which was the manufacturing center of the United States, basically, all of a sudden were out of a job. Their skills were not transferable. They could not just move to Silicon Valley and pick up a job writing computer codes. Those jobs were filled out mostly by people coming in from India who had technical skills and other places. So those people were essentially the ones that Donald Trump spoke to, who had been disenfranchised by this process of outsourcing and globalization. And that's why he talks about, bring back those jobs to the US. That's what he's talking about. So what he's trying to do is essentially dismantle this world order of trade and globalization and go back to a localized economies or regional economies where now all of those goods will be manufactured back in the US. And so that's where tariffs come into play. Tariffs play a role in that. There's other parts which have to do with charging countries for, the US Navy patrolling the waters and things like that. So essentially that's where the tariffs come in. It's he wants manufacturing to go back to the US from places like China. And so how do you do that? Well, essentially now, sure, you save on labor costs by putting your plants in China, but then when that product, typically an intermediate product, enters the United States, now you have to pay 25% tariff. Whatever you save on labor, you're losing on the tariff. So that's the first point. Then, so hopefully that helps understand a little bit what's going on. Then there is what I thought was going to happen is that a lot of that cheap labor that was going in China, a lot of companies were going to, use Mexico as a replacement of that. And so this was going to be great news for Mexican economy because essentially like a more regional version of that, take the car manufacturing as an example, the supply chain of car production is distributed over Mexico, the US, and Canada, and different parts are produced in different places depending on what is cheaper, what are the advantages, and so on. So apparently, it seems that that's why Trump probably had to back up with the car industry, because car manufacturers products go back and forth through the border several times. The effective tariffs on car production will be much higher, which means the cost of American car manufacturers will go up by a lot. And so that's why he probably has to backpedal a little bit, because those processes of dismantling supply chains and building the necessary infrastructure, let's say even Ford or GM wanted to produce the car entirely in the US, that's a process that takes time. It cannot happen overnight. Then going to the tariffs themselves and what would be the effect for Canadians. Obviously, the effect of U.S. implementing tariffs, it will affect fairly specialized sectors, which are the sectors that export to the U.S. and mostly they're going to have to do with energy. They're going to have to do with the car industry, as I said, which some of the intermediate goods are produced. So part of the supply of car manufacturing is in Canada, and then you have a lot of lumber out of British Columbia going into the US, and those things obviously will take a hit, and that's kind of like the intended consequences. That is sometimes this is referred to as import substitution. Trump wants those that imported wood coming from Canada now to be replaced by domestically produced wood in the US, even though perhaps at a slightly higher cost. It will give job to US workers and not Canadian workers, and so on. So that's kind of like the intended consequence. If you put in the short run, that's going to hurt those sectors until what is the response to that? Well, the oil sector now has to find other customers for its oil if it doesn't want to sell it to America. And then that takes infrastructure. It takes a certain time of adjustment, and so things are not easy. In the short term, what it could mean is that now all of a sudden, if you can't sell oil to the U.S., then you're going to have a lot of oil lying around that you don't have nobody else to sell but the domestic market, which will perhaps push prices down. Although I wouldn't count on that on certain things. And the other thing will be, reduction in production, which will lead to unemployment. People losing their jobs, which can kind of trickle to the rest of the economy. And then comes the response to those tariffs. The response to those tariffs will have to do with how Canada responds to that. Now, Canada economy and the U.S. economy is like David and Goliath. I believe, that the Canadian tariffs of American products won't have a big impact on the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy is very big. It has a huge domestic market, and sales to Canada are relatively small. And essentially what it will mean for Canadians is now all goods imported from the US will be more expensive for Canadians here. Now the question is, how much of that is going to go to Canadian importers of those goods, and how much is going to go to the Canadian consumers? And so, like any tax, that's going to have to do with the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. So how much are Canadian consumers can find substitutes from the American products, and then there's the question about how those Canadian substitutes, how are they going to respond to the tariff? So let's say you're a Canadian producer of whiskey, and now Canadian bourbon has gone up in price. Now you have a bit of an advantage. People maybe like American whiskey better, so it's not exactly a perfect substitute, but they'll be similar. So now you have more people buying your product. And so that maybe you can increase your price too. So Canadian or domestically produced goods may go up in price too. How much they go up to? And here's something interesting: if you adopt this buy Canadian policy, that actually allows Canadian producers to raise their prices more. So in some sense, I feel the buy Canadian in response may end up making an increase in prices of domestically produced goods more severe and hurt more Canadian producers. So in some sense, the buy Canadian is going to help Canadian producers, but not so much Canadian consumers. And then let me finish. What do I think may be a more appropriate response? Well, I don't think putting back tariffs is going to do any dent, and it's going to be a significant cost for Canadian consumers, which are already in a difficult situation. So one thing that I feel more relevant is try to go after U.S. Human capital. So let's go after all those H-1B highly skilled workers in Silicon Valley from India, and all of a sudden they're no more wanted in the US. They're having to go through a lot more hurdles. Bring those guys to Canada. That's gonna start raising some eyebrows in the US kind of technology sector, which is one of the main drivers of the US economy, or an important sector of the US economy. Similarly, at universities, the intellectuals in the US who oppose Trump, bring them over to Canada, set up nice positions for them here. If you go after like more specialized, highly skilled people, make them offers to come to Canada, that may start raising some eyebrows more than tariffs, because they Americans can produce milk, lumber, and all the things that we sell them, even energy. So that I think may be more effective. And let me finish with a thought about an important thing or kind of thing to follow is what's the effect on the interest rate decisions, both by the U.S. But also the Canadian Central Bank, so the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Central Bank. And there it's not so clear. Now, if tariffs are put in place by Trump and the Central Bank of Canada believes that that's actually, even though that's inflationary, if the Canadian government responds that's inflationary, that may make inflation worse. And so even though the higher interest rates have worked lowering inflation, it may pause the lowering the interest rates. On the other hand, if the tariff actually make the Canadian economy go into a recession more likely, that may actually make the Canadian Central Bank to lower interest rates faster, and that actually may bring relief for homeowners who've been struggling with mortgage payments and things like that. So it's another thing to follow. So anyway, I just thought I would share some thoughts to help people think about and share some of my views on this issue, and let me know what you think.